Do you know how to restart your faith when God feels distant? There comes a moment when faith no longer feels like light, but like fog. You whisper prayers that vanish into the air, search the silence for a pulse of the divine, and find only your own echo. You begin to wonder if you've been speaking to emptiness all along. It's a quiet crisis that few talk about, but nearly everyone encounters. The season when God feels far, and your belief begins to tremble under the weight of unanswered questions. But what if this silence isn't absence? What if it's the raw material of a deeper transformation? The greatest test of faith isn't the absence of miracles, it's the absence of response. When the brain is wired for expectation and reward, that silence feels like punishment. Yet neuroscience shows that what you interpret as rejection is often recalibration. The circuits of faith are not built in the comfort of answers. They are forged in the tension of waiting, in the space where the mind screams for evidence and the heart is forced to learn the rhythm of trust. Judith Beck would say this is where cognitive restructuring begins. Your thoughts about silence determine whether you descend into despair or ascend into understanding. If you label the quiet as abandonment, your belief system collapses under the weight of perceived loss. But if you name it as transformation, you engage the mind's most powerful tool, neuroplasticity, the ability to reshape meaning itself. What you believe about God during his silence rewires the architecture of your faith. Descartes once said, "To doubt is to think, and to think is to exist." In that sense, even your doubt is sacred. It's the proof that your soul is still reaching, still alive, still searching for alignment between logic and longing. Faith that never questions is faith that never grows. It becomes mechanical, predictable, domesticated. But when your faith cracks, when the silence stretches long enough to unsettle your certainty, something essential happens. The walls of inherited belief collapse, and a more authentic connection begins to form, not based on what you were told to feel, but on what you truly experience. This moment, this silence, is not the end of your faith. It's its reintroduction. The reset doesn't begin when God speaks again. It begins when you stop demanding sound and start listening to the stillness. The human mind, as Andrew Huberman explains, is built to adapt through discomfort. Each time you sit with silence without running, your nervous system learns safety in uncertainty. Your body stops bracing for disappointment and starts opening to presence. That is where renewal begins, not in divine noise, but in divine quiet. And that's what this journey is about. 13 moments that will guide you through the anatomy of faith's restart, from the echo of heaven's silence to the rediscovery of the God who never left. You'll see how psychology, neuroscience, and ancient philosophy converge into one truth: that silence is not a void to fear, but a field where the spirit rebuilds its voice. Because maybe God was never gone. Maybe he was just waiting for you to finally slow down enough to hear him again, the echo of heaven's silence. There is a peculiar kind of silence that doesn't come from the world around you. It comes from the space between you and the divine. It's not the silence of an empty room, but the silence that hums beneath your prayers, that expands inside you after every amen. It's the moment you realize you can still talk to God, but you no longer feel him answering back. That's when the human soul begins to wrestle not with sin or doubt, but with meaning itself. In psychology, this is called spiritual dissonance, the gap between what you believe and what you feel. The brain struggles to reconcile the logic of faith with the emotional absence of reassurance. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for reasoning and meaning-making, collides with the limbic system, where emotion and reward reside. This internal tension is not evidence of failure, it's evidence of growth. When God feels silent, the mind is being invited to mature beyond emotional dependency into conscious trust. Think of it as a mirror. The silence you hear is often the echo of your own distance, the reflections of distraction, fear, or fatigue. When your inner world is loud with anxiety, the divine voice doesn't vanish. It simply becomes drowned out by the volume of your thoughts. Andrew Huberman describes how chronic mental noise reduces your ability to perceive subtle stimuli. In spiritual terms, the same applies. The more you strain to hear, the more your own tension muffles what's already present. This is why the first step toward restarting your faith is not to beg for answers, but to recondition your perception. Faith begins again when you stop seeking external confirmation and start listening inwardly with curiosity instead of desperation. As Judith Beck might say, the silence isn't a punishment to escape. It's a cognitive reset, a pause designed to help you observe your thoughts, question your assumptions, and notice what surfaces in the stillness. Because that's where the echo of heaven begins to speak again, not in thunder but in awareness. When you quiet the inner storm, the silence turns into a teacher. It shows you that God was never absent. He was waiting for you to become still enough to recognize his presence disguised as peace. The moment faith turns to static, there comes a point when faith no longer feels alive. It starts sounding like background noise. You still pray, you still go through the motions, but something within you has lost its pulse. It's not disbelief, it's numbness. The spiritual signal that once moved through your heart now feels distorted, like an old radio searching for a frequency that used to come in clearly but now only crackles. That static is the space where clarity begins to fade and ritual replaces relationship. This moment doesn't happen suddenly. It builds slowly, almost invisibly. You stop feeling the same spark in your prayers. The verses that once ignited meaning now drift past your attention. It's the quiet slide from encounter to effort, from presence to performance. Psychologically, it's a kind of spiritual fatigue, the product of overstimulation and expectation. The mind, conditioned to chase emotional highs, grows resistant to subtlety. When you depend on constant divine reassurance, your brain begins to dull its response to stillness, just as it does to any repeated stimulus. Andrew Huberman would call this the habituation effect. The brain stops registering what feels familiar, even if it's sacred. That's why your faith starts to feel flat. You've repeated the form without renewing the focus. Your neural pathways have adapted to the habit, but forgotten the meaning behind it. The signal of faith becomes static when practice is preserved, but presence is lost. In that static lies the invitation to awaken again. Judith Beck might suggest noticing the thought patterns that accompany this numbness. What are you telling yourself when you pray and feel nothing? That God doesn't care? That you've failed? Or that maybe the silence is your fault? These interpretations fuel emotional detachment. But when you reframe the static not as punishment, but as feedback, something changes. You stop fearing the quiet and start reading it as data, your mind showing you where renewal is required. The moment faith turns to static is not the death of belief. It's the signal that your spirit is asking for depth. It's the nervous system telling you it's time to move from surface repetition to conscious awareness. Because beneath the static, the frequency still exists. It just needs tuning. And sometimes God lowers the volume of his voice, so you'll finally listen for him within your own, when God stops speaking to your emotions. At some point in every believer's journey, there's a breaking point, the moment when God stops speaking through feelings. You no longer sense his presence like a warmth washing over you during prayer. You no longer cry at worship songs or feel that familiar surge of peace when you whisper his name. Instead, there's quiet, flatness, a strange neutrality that feels like abandonment, but is actually evolution. This is the phase where faith begins to outgrow emotional dependency. For years, you may have associated God's presence with emotional intensity, assuming that if you didn't feel him, he wasn't there. But emotion was never meant to be the language of certainty. It was meant to be the bridge. Once the bridge is crossed, silence arrives to anchor you in conviction instead of chemistry. Andrew Huberman would explain it through neural adaptation. Your dopamine circuits, once triggered by spiritual emotion, start seeking stability over stimulation. The absence of feeling isn't a void. It's your brain shifting from emotional reaction to cognitive integration. Judith Beck would say this is where emotional reasoning must be challenged. You feel distant, therefore you believe God is distant. But feelings are not facts. They are data, not definitions. When you understand this, your perception of divine silence begins to change. You stop measuring God's presence by your mood and start recognizing him through alignment, awareness, and groundedness. Philosophically, Descartes would describe this as the transition from sensory to rational faith. The senses fade so the intellect can awaken. The stillness you feel is not absence, it's recalibration. It's the Creator rewiring your perception so your belief can exist independent of emotion, rooted in something deeper, truth that remains steady even when the heart trembles. This is the sacred detox, the phase where the emotional intensity that once validated your faith is stripped away so that trust can stand on its own legs. It's painful because you've confused emotion with connection. But what you're losing is not God. It's your dependence on emotional proof. You're learning to recognize Him through peace that doesn't need to shout, through calm that doesn't need to prove itself holy. When God stops speaking to your emotions, it's not rejection, it's graduation. The silence is Him saying, "You no longer need feelings to find me. You've grown enough to hear me in the quiet logic of your soul." The hidden curriculum of delay. Every silence has a lesson woven into it. Every unanswered prayer carries a curriculum your heart didn't know it enrolled in. When God delays, the impatient mind interprets it as neglect, but the wiser soul begins to suspect purpose. There's something sacred in the stretch of waiting, a subtle education that no miracle could ever teach. Delay trains the nervous system to sustain hope without evidence. It rewires your relationship with time itself. When the outcome doesn't arrive, your brain's reward circuits, those same dopamine pathways Andrew Huberman often describes, start to protest. The body wants closure. The mind craves certainty. Yet the spiritual journey demands endurance through uncertainty, which is the exact mechanism that strengthens resilience. What feels like divine silence is often neurobiological stretching, building your capacity to stay calm in chaos and trust when your senses detect nothing. Judith Beck would call this cognitive reframing in motion. You're learning to interpret waiting not as punishment, but as preparation. The thoughts that surface during delay reveal your inner structure, your fears, your assumptions about control, your unspoken expectations of God. When you observe them without reacting, something powerful happens. The waiting turns into witnessing. You start to see your own mind as a classroom where patience teaches perspective. Philosophically, this delay is the crucible of reason. Descartes believed that doubt, when guided by disciplined thought, leads to clearer truth. The same principle applies here. Faith deepens when tested by divine slowness. Each unanswered prayer becomes an invitation to refine the quality of your belief, transforming emotional need into intellectual trust. In the hidden curriculum of delay, God teaches endurance by silence and wisdom by absence. It's not that He isn't moving, it's that He's teaching you to synchronize your rhythm with His. The delay forces you to stop measuring divine timing by human urgency. It dissolves the illusion that control equals safety, and in that surrender, your faith begins to breathe again, stronger, quieter, and far more real. When God delays, He's not withholding your answer. He's shaping the kind of person who can hold it without breaking. Unlearning the addiction to signs. Every seeker eventually reaches a point where faith becomes like chasing smoke. You start looking for patterns everywhere. Numbers, coincidences, songs that appear at the right time. Small hints that maybe God is still paying attention. It's human nature. The mind craves confirmation. When heaven feels quiet, we build meaning out of fragments, trying to decode messages from a God who seems to have stopped writing. But the truth is, this constant search for signs can become a subtle addiction, one that keeps you dependent on reassurance instead of relationship. The brain's reward system is wired for feedback. Each sign triggers a burst of dopamine, giving you temporary comfort. It feels divine, but often it's just the nervous system trying to ease uncertainty. Andrew Huberman's research on attention explains that when we expect meaning, we start seeing it everywhere, whether or not it's really there. This is not faith, it's fear in disguise, an attempt to make the invisible tangible again. The addiction to signs grows from the discomfort of not knowing, and it can quietly erode the purity of trust. Judith Beck would say, this is where cognitive distortion slips in. You interpret neutrality as rejection, coincidence as command, and emotion as evidence. But faith was never meant to depend on external validation. The more you chase proof, the less room you give for true presence. You begin relating to God like a performer waiting for applause, instead of a friend learning to sit comfortably in silence. To unlearn this addiction is to reclaim spiritual adulthood. It's to stop asking for the universe to wink at you and start cultivating stillness that doesn't demand explanation. Descartes might call this the discipline of clear perception, the practice of separating what the mind projects from what truly is. When you stop chasing signs, you begin to recognize God not in patterns but in principles, not in random coincidences, but in quiet conviction. Faith matures when you no longer need constant proof of its existence, when your trust stops relying on divine theatrics and starts resting in the unshakable calm of inner knowing. Because sometimes the clearest sign from God is no sign at all. It's the peace that remains even when nothing changes. The neurology of doubt. Doubt feels like betrayal, but in truth it's evolution. It's the moment when belief steps out of imitation and begins to search for authenticity. The human brain was designed to question, to refine understanding through conflict. When faith collides with doubt, it's not breaking, it's adapting. What you call a spiritual crisis is, biologically speaking, neuroplasticity in motion. Andrew Huberman often describes how uncertainty activates the brain's anterior cingulate cortex, the region responsible for error detection and learning. When you face doubt, that part of your brain lights up, signaling that new information or a new way of perceiving old truths is on the horizon. In other words, doubt doesn't destroy belief, it expands its capacity. Every time your faith is questioned, your neural networks stretch, allowing more complexity, more nuance, and eventually deeper conviction. Judith Beck might frame it differently. Doubt exposes the hidden assumptions that shape your faith narrative. If you've built belief around the expectation that God must feel constant, predictable, or visible, doubt tears through that illusion. It forces you to separate what's true from what's comforting. Cognitive restructuring begins when you challenge automatic thoughts like, "If I doubt, I've failed." Instead, you replace them with, "If I doubt, I'm learning to think for myself." Philosophically, Descartes called this methodic doubt, the process of questioning everything until only what is undeniably real remains. When applied spiritually, it becomes a purification of belief. The noise of inherited religion fades, and what's left is something fiercely personal. Faith that has passed through doubt is not fragile, it's bulletproof. It no longer needs emotional validation or social consensus. It stands because it has faced its own collapse and chosen to rise again. Neurologically and spiritually, doubt is the mind's way of updating its model of reality. It's a sign that your consciousness is maturing, demanding a faith that can withstand silence, contradiction, and complexity. So when doubt appears, don't run from it. Observe it. Let it question you back. Because on the other side of that questioning is not emptiness, it's clarity. And clarity is where God begins to make sense again. The collapse before the call. Before faith renews, it often shatters. There's a breaking that must come before rebuilding, a collapse that feels final, but is actually the beginning of reorganization. You'll know it when it happens. The prayers feel heavy, the scriptures seem distant, and your identity as a believer begins to crumble. What used to give you meaning now confronts you with emptiness. It's terrifying, but that emptiness is not the end. It's the clearing. In psychology, this is the dismantling phase, a point where the mind can no longer sustain old patterns of belief that no longer align with growth. Judith Beck might describe it as the moment when cognitive dissonance becomes too great to ignore. You're forced to let go of comforting illusions to make room for authentic understanding. It's not that faith disappears, it's that the container holding it breaks open. Neuroscience shows that transformation requires this kind of neural chaos. Andrew Huberman explains that during periods of deep stress or loss, the brain enters a hyperplastic state. It becomes more malleable, more capable of rewriting its own pathways. That collapse you feel emotionally mirrors what's happening neurologically. The old circuits of certainty are dissolving so that something new can emerge. But the brain doesn't know the difference between destruction and transformation. It only feels disruption. That's why spiritual renewal feels like death before it feels like rebirth. Descartes would have called this the necessary void before truth. To reach clarity, you must first endure the demolition of false conclusions. It's the silence before revelation, the chaos before alignment. The collapse doesn't signal divine abandonment. It marks the moment your internal architecture is being redesigned. Faith cannot evolve in comfort. It evolves in collapse. So when everything inside you feels like it's falling apart, understand this. The collapse is not a curse. It's the body's and spirit's joint strategy for renewal. The foundation is being cleared, the noise dismantled, the self reset. Because before the call comes, the echo must die. And only when you've let go of the version of faith that depended on feelings, can you finally receive the one that depends on truth. Where God hides in the human mind. If you could look inside your own mind during a season of silence, you'd see something extraordinary. God was never gone. He was hidden, tucked beneath the noise of thought, behind the clutter of constant analysis, waiting in the quiet spaces your awareness rarely visits. The divine doesn't vanish. It retreats inward, into the layers of consciousness we often ignore. To rediscover him, you don't need to reach higher. You need to descend deeper. Neuroscience confirms what mystics have always intuited. The human brain has regions built for transcendence. The parietal lobes, when calmed through prayer or stillness, reduce the brain's sense of separateness, allowing the perception of oneness, what spiritual tradition calls presence. Andrew Huberman often explains that attention is the steering wheel of consciousness. Wherever your focus rests, your brain devotes its resources there. And when your focus is fragmented, scattered by fear, distraction, or overthinking, the awareness of God becomes drowned in mental static. He hasn't left. He's simply hidden beneath divided attention. Judith Beck would describe this as an attentional distortion. When you fixate on anxiety, you amplify absence. When you redirect focus to calm observation, you begin to perceive what's been there all along. This is where cognitive therapy meets contemplative practice, the act of noticing without judging, allowing stillness to reveal what's striving obscured. Philosophically, Descartes might call this the inward proof of existence, the cogito not as self-centered thought, but as divine mirror. I think, therefore I am, becomes I am aware, therefore I perceive the eternal within. God hides in the folds of awareness because that's where transformation happens, in the moment your consciousness stops reaching outward and begins to witness itself. Finding him again is not a mystical trick, it's the discipline of returning your mind to presence. When your thoughts slow down enough, the divine emerges not as a voice but as awareness itself, a vast still field that holds everything you are. The more you practice awareness, the less you chase feelings, and the more you recognize that the presence you were praying for has always been the one observing the prayer. God doesn't hide from you to punish you. He hides in you to awaken you, rebuilding the temple within. Once the collapse settles and silence begins to soften, something sacred happens. You begin to rebuild, not the way you once did with borrowed beliefs or inherited rituals, but from the inside out. Rebuilding the temple within isn't about returning to what was lost. It's about constructing a deeper, quieter faith, one built on awareness rather than noise. The first foundation stone is presence, the willingness to return to yourself without fear. In the psychological sense, Judith Beck might call this the reconstruction of cognitive alignment. Every thought, every internal dialogue becomes a brick in this new temple. Instead of repeating old narratives like, "I'm not spiritual enough," or "God has left me," you start replacing them with intentional truths. This process rewires neural pathways, teaching your brain to interpret silence not as absence, but as invitation. Each conscious breath becomes a prayer. Each moment of awareness becomes a sacred space. Andrew Huberman's work on neuroplasticity confirms that daily, consistent focus physically reshapes the brain. When you commit to stillness, gratitude, or mindful reflection, you're literally rebuilding the architecture of faith inside your own neural network. Your spiritual life stops depending on external triggers. It becomes embodied. The nervous system begins associating peace with presence, not performance. Slowly, belief transforms from an abstract hope into a lived physiological reality. Philosophically, this echoes Descartes' pursuit of inner order. To rebuild the temple, is to return to the foundation of clarity, to align thought, emotion, and spirit until truth feels familiar again. And this reconstruction isn't dramatic, it's subtle. It happens in the pauses between breaths, in the quiet decision to pray without expecting to feel something, in the act of noticing beauty without demanding proof of divinity. The temple within is not made of certainty, it's made of consistency. You rebuild it one choice at a time, choosing silence over noise, gratitude over fear, and awareness over autopilot. Over time, this quiet discipline becomes worship itself. You realize that you don't have to seek God somewhere else, because every time you return to awareness, you've already found Him. The structure of your faith is no longer fragile. It's living architecture, constantly growing, self-healing, unshakable. Because the true temple was never built by hands, but by the mind and heart learning how to meet in stillness. Faith as neural reprogramming. Faith isn't just spiritual, it's biological. Every thought about God, every prayer whispered in uncertainty, every act of surrender leaves a trace inside your neural pathways. The mind doesn't separate belief from behavior, it encodes them both. That means faith isn't something you merely have, it's something your brain builds through repetition, focus, and interpretation. Andrew Huberman would call this the process of experience-dependent plasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself according to what you consistently focus on. When your attention is anchored in fear, your neural networks strengthen patterns of anxiety and mistrust. But when your attention is trained on faith, even without feeling, it rewires your emotional system to associate uncertainty with peace instead of panic. Over time, this consistent redirection transforms your inner state from reactive to resilient. Judith Beck might explain this as the cognitive shift that turns abstract belief into embodied conviction. Every time you choose to reinterpret silence as presence, you're performing a mental reconditioning exercise. You're teaching your prefrontal cortex to regulate your emotional brain, creating a bridge between thought and feeling, a neurological act of faith. You're literally programming your mind to believe in calm before it arrives, to trust before it confirms. That's not delusion, it's transformation in progress. Philosophically, Descartes might frame this as the discipline of mastering perception. The mind learns to govern the senses rather than be ruled by them. Faith, then, becomes not the rejection of reason, but its refinement, the decision to let clarity lead where emotion can't. Each act of faith becomes an experiment in neurobiology and consciousness, proving that what you repeatedly choose to believe begins to shape who you are at the cellular level. This is the hidden science behind spiritual resilience. Your faith is not a feeling you chase, it's a neural pattern you train. The same circuits that once carried anxiety can be rerouted toward peace through repetition, attention, and truth. Prayer, meditation, and reflection aren't empty rituals. They are neurological rewiring sessions where the sacred meets the synapse. In time, faith becomes less about fighting doubt and more about forming identity. Your brain stops asking for evidence because it has learned to recognize peace as proof. You're no longer believing in faith, you're becoming it. When silence starts to speak. There's a moment, after the long ache of unanswered prayers, when silence itself begins to change shape. It no longer feels like emptiness pressing against your chest. It begins to breathe. You start to realize that the quiet wasn't God's absence, it was His language. Every pause, every still moment was forming a kind of dialogue beyond words. When silence starts to speak, it doesn't shout, it resonates, it reveals. Psychologically, this is when the mind transitions from reaction to awareness. Judith Beck might describe it as the shift from automatic thinking to reflective observation. The silence that once triggered fear now invites curiosity. You stop asking, "Why won't God answer?" and start asking, "What is this moment trying to teach me?" That single change in questioning transforms the experience. The brain moves from the threat response system, governed by the amygdala, to the prefrontal cortex, the center of reasoning and integration. Emotion softens, perspective widens, meaning begins to emerge. Andrew Huberman explains that when the nervous system finally feels safe, perception expands. This means that only in inner stillness can you truly begin to hear. The signals that were always there, subtle intuitions, small insights, quiet nudges, become audible again. Your body stops bracing against silence and starts recognizing it as communication. The stillness becomes sacred dialogue between awareness and the infinite. Philosophically, Descartes would see this as the birth of pure clarity, the point where thought and being align. You stop chasing transcendence because you realize you're already inside it. Silence, once feared as proof of abandonment, now feels like home. It teaches you the profound truth that God doesn't only speak through voice or emotion, but through the structure of perception itself. When silence speaks, it doesn't tell you what to do. It shows you how to be. It draws you into the rhythm of divine stillness, where insight arises without effort. You begin to trust not because you understand, but because peace no longer needs explanation. The quiet becomes a living teacher, whispering through the nervous system, reminding you that revelation is not always loud. It's often as soft as your next breath. That's when you realize silence was never the test. It was the teaching, the return of presence. There comes a quiet morning when something shifts, not in the sky, but in you. You can't pinpoint the moment, but the weight of emptiness begins to lift. The silence that once suffocated now feels spacious. You sense that something ancient has returned, not with thunder or revelation, but with calm. This is the return of presence. Not the dramatic feeling of God rushing back, but the slow recognition that he never left. What changed was your capacity to notice. In neuroscience, Andrew Huberman would call this the stabilization phase, the point where the nervous system learns to regulate without external proof of safety. The very circuits that once fired in panic at divine silence now respond with grounded awareness. The body begins to trust again. Your breath slows, your attention expands, and you realize that presence is not an emotion to chase, it's a state you cultivate. The brain's chemistry mirrors this truth. Peace is not the absence of conflict, it's the mastery of response. Judith Beck might describe this as cognitive integration, the moment when new belief patterns have replaced old distortions. You no longer interpret quiet as neglect, delay as denial, or doubt as failure. Your internal dialogue shifts from God is gone to God is here, even when I don't perceive him. This reframing anchors you in spiritual maturity. Your faith becomes less about what you feel and more about what you know. Philosophically, Descartes might call this the restoration of unity between reason and spirit. The fragmented self, the thinker, the feeler, the doubter, begins to harmonize. You no longer need constant reassurance because your very being becomes evidence of divine order. The presence you once begged for is now inseparable from your awareness. The return of presence is not a dramatic miracle. It's subtle but undeniable. It's the quiet understanding that peace doesn't arrive from the outside. It emerges when your mind stops resisting reality. It's the body relaxing into trust, the soul remembering its home, the mind finding rhythm in stillness. You stop seeking God as a visitor and begin living as his dwelling place. Presence is the fruit of surrender, the reward of silence endured and transformed. Goethe's the sacred moment, when heaven no longer feels far because you finally stopped measuring distance in feelings and started recognizing it in consciousness. The God who waited inside you. When the silence ends and presence returns, you realize the most unexpected truth of all. God was never distant. He was waiting inside you, patiently, through every unanswered prayer, every sleepless night, every question you buried beneath frustration. He wasn't watching from afar. He was living within your awareness, waiting for you to stop reaching outward long enough to finally look inward. What you called absence was, in reality, a divine strategy. The silence wasn't meant to punish. It was meant to purify. It stripped away your dependence on emotion, your addiction to signs, your hunger for constant reassurance. It led you through disconnection so that faith could move from something you feel to something you are. Andrew Huberman would describe this as the brain's ultimate recalibration, your nervous system learning to find stability without stimulus, peace without proof. That's where spiritual maturity begins, when the body learns to rest, even when heaven is quiet. Judith Beck might call this the final stage of cognitive renewal, where the old patterns of fear no longer define your interpretation of silence. You've stopped framing distance as rejection and started seeing it as reflection. The mirror has turned inward. What you used to call a spiritual void was simply an undiscovered depth within your own consciousness. And if Descartes could see this moment, he might redefine his most famous idea. I think, therefore I am would evolve into I am aware, therefore God is. Awareness itself becomes the proof of divine continuity. Every thought, every breath, every quiet heartbeat is evidence of a presence that never left. It only waited for your recognition. This is the ending that isn't an ending. The silence that once felt unbearable now becomes sacred rhythm, the pulse of a faith reborn, not in emotion, but in understanding. You walk away not with the thrill of rediscovery, but with the stillness of realization. You were never abandoned, only invited deeper. The God you sought in the sky was whispering from within the architecture of your own being. You weren't waiting for him. He was waiting for you, to finally return home to the quiet, steady center where divinity and consciousness meet. And when you reach that place, you no longer ask where God went. You simply breathe, aware at last that he never left at all.